Have you ever struggled with knowledge management, or this idea of personal knowledge management? That is taking information, right? Reading something, learning something, bringing it in, storing it, keeping it in a place where we can recall it, right? And then using that information and doing it in an efficient manner. This is what being an academic physician is all about, right? As part of my practice, I see patients clinically, but the other part of the practice is I'm producing content. And for me, it's mostly educational content in the form of lectures, right? I've done some paper writing, some research projects, things like that. And so one of the important aspects of being an academic physician is taking knowledge, right? Dealing with knowledge, dealing with this information economy, and doing it in an efficient manner to be able to produce some work and not have to reinvent the wheel every single time. And this can be a challenge, right? This is something that is difficult to learn and difficult to do. And it is really helpful to have some tools that will aid and assist. And so over the course of my career, I've looked for a number of different tools that can help in various different aspects of productivity in this knowledge management. And I've found a lot of things, and a lot of them come up short until one of my friends introduced me to an application that has changed and revolutionized how I do my personal knowledge management at home, in my personal life, as well as professionally in my work life. And that application is called Obsidian. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about Obsidian and not really get into the details yet of how to set things up, but really the why. Why do you as an academic physician, or why do you as someone who deals with information, want to get involved in working with Obsidian? And so today we're going to talk about 5 reasons why I think Obsidian is helpful for me, and 5 reasons why I think Obsidian would be helpful for you as you're dealing with your own personal knowledge management. Reason number 1, when we're dealing with information, we need to capture ideas as they emerge. So as an academic physician, or as an academic in whatever profession you happen to find yourself in, we deal in an information economy. That is, we deal not necessarily in brick and mortar and things that we build, but things that we think. And then those things that we then produce in the form of papers, lectures, videos, content, things that we kind of generate out of ideas that we have. So unlike a carpenter who spends his life building things and can at the end of the day stand back and look at that which has been created, we don't necessarily have that same luxury, right? We don't have the ability to stand back at the end of the day and say, wow, look at all the things that I've built, right? We have a lot of ideas that we have generated, that we've thought through, that we've processed, and hopefully that we've produced into some form of consumable content. But we really don't have a lot of brick and mortar things that we build. So our productivity is not necessarily measured in houses built, but in lectures given, papers written, research ideas that are promulgated, and ideas that are then passed from one generation of physician to the next. So academic medicine is this interesting blend, right? This interesting blend of something that you do kind of create, but it's also something that is very scientific. But on the other hand, it is also something that's somewhat creative, right? So there's a lot of structure in terms of how you need to, organize a paper, how you need to set up a research study, how you need to present a lecture. But in that structure, there's also a lot of opportunity to be creative. There's a lot of opportunity to grow an idea, to develop that, to kind of put your own spin and flavor on that, to make it something unique and make it something interesting, as opposed to just here's the numbers and here's all these different things that we need to present. And specifically in my area of medicine, right, in terms of education and lecturing, there's a whole lot of creativity that you can apply to how you convey a concept, how you take an idea and transmit it to a learner, right, in a way that they'll capture that information and find it interesting in the process. And so this obviously requires a lot of thought. And what's interesting, if you're anything like me, a lot of these thoughts don't necessarily come when I'm sitting at my desk, pen in hand, and say, okay, now it's time to write a lecture. They come at 2 a.m. when I happen to wake up. They come in between patients when I'm on shift, or they come when I'm driving home from a shift, right? They come at inopportune times. And so the key is learning ways and finding ways and developing ways of capturing that creative spark, that inspiration when it happens, putting it in a place where we can find it again, but also in a place where we can grow that idea, where we can build that idea, where we can develop that idea into something that will eventually become, a part of a lecture or part of a piece of paper. So the key is to find a solution or find a process where we can take that idea when it happens, when it emerges, and store that and record that so that we can process that, we can build on that, we can link that to other ideas as part of this development of a lecture or a paper or something that we want to produce. Historically, this happened in the context of something that was called a commonplace book, right? It's a notebook of some sort where you can basically have with you at all times, and when you have an idea, you can jot that idea down, right? You can write it, and then you can come back to it later and really develop that idea. But the problem with the commonplace book is, number one, it's something to carry, right? This doesn't fit terribly well in my pocket. But also, number two, when you write something down, it has to be findable again. It has to be searchable. And so this is a random assortment of ideas that I've had at random times that don't necessarily relate to one another. And when I try to relate that to a broader idea as a whole, it's really kind of stuck in this notebook. And, it's really hard to then build that idea outside of this notebook without then transcribing it down into some other piece of paper. So while this is helpful, while this is a tool, it really doesn't scratch the itch that we have or fit the bill that we're really looking to fulfill when we're creating these and developing these ideas. And this is where Obsidian comes into play. Obsidian is a computer application that can live on your computer, live on your mobile device, that really can capture all these pieces of information. And the beauty of Obsidian, the cornerstone of Obsidian, is being able to link that idea with other thoughts. And so as I have an idea, I may grab my phone, right? I may be able to jot down an idea real quick and link that to another idea that I've had that's similar to this, so that when it's time to come back, when it's time to redevelop this issue, that I can look back at it, say, what is this linked to? All the other things that are related to this idea, and have a broader understanding and a little bit more contextual idea of where I'm going with this idea, and have some support material I can to add on to it and develop this idea. And so that's reason number one why Obsidian is helpful, right? It's a place to capture those ideas when they emerge, when they happen, and link them to some other ideas to help you develop these thoughts that you have as you're producing your lecture, your paper, your project, whatever that may be. Reason number two is just straight up efficiency. The most efficient way of getting from point A to point B is a straight line. And the most efficient way of doing things in academic medicine is just once, right? If you read a paper, it doesn't make sense to read it again and again and again and again, right? But what I find myself doing over the years is I have a project on a topic. I pull all the papers, I read them, I synthesize the information, I develop my lecture, and then I throw it all away, right? Maybe I have my lecture still, but I throw away all the supporting material. But then a couple years down the line, I have to give a similar lecture or develop a lecture on a similar topic. And what do I have to do? I have to find all that material again. I know I've read it, but I got to find it again. I got to reread it. I got to resynthesize it and develop it into lecture number 2, right? And fortunately, there's some economies that happen as you do this over and over again, but it's really an inefficient way of storing that information, of developing that information. If you can do it once and then keep that in a way that you can go back to it and easily find your notes, it really helps with efficiency as you're developing your projects. And so the reason number 2 for Obsidian is it is a place, right, where you can store not just that information that you've read, right, not the data that you've pulled with your articles, your notes and your thoughts on the articles at the time, but also all these related notes about the topic, right? You can really save your work in Obsidian through a series of notes that are all linked together, so that you can go back to this and you say, okay, here's the work I did for this project. Now I have a related project. I'm going to pull half of this material over and be able to use it in this secondary project and really get these efficiencies of scale that you can have. That's hard to develop elsewhere. I've tried this in the past with things like Word documents or notes on my computer, and it requires some degree of discipline to be able to maintain that. But again, they're unique documents that live on their own that don't necessarily cross these boundaries between projects. And so with the linking properties in Obsidian, it really gives you that ability to take this work and duplicate it and use it time and time and time again to really expand the work that you're doing academically and increase your productivity. Reason number 3 is you need a place to keep your journal articles. Right. This is something that I've struggled with over the years in my own professional practice. I'd read articles, I'd highlight them. There's some nice quality of having an article on paper and you can take notes there. But again, it lives on the paper, right? And so it's good in the moment. You can process that information in the moment, but it's really hard to archive that without having just stacks of paper. And then when you go through that, do you put it in notebooks? Do you have it just stacks on the floor? Like, how do you organize this thing so you can go back and use it again, right? And I know there's multiple software systems where you can store your papers, right? Store your PDFs and have an archive. But again, I was struggling to use those for a while until I landed on this Obsidian plus Zotero combination, right? And so Zotero is a software system where you can store PDFs, and we'll go through more of this later, but you can store the PDFs, you can have all the metadata there, but then it has these links that you can pull all that information into Obsidian. So I can develop a map of concept, right? Or a map of ideas around a central topic. So if I'm doing a lecture on, let's say, doing ultrasound of the gallbladder, right? I can have my notes on, doing ultrasound of the gallbladder in my note or in my main note, but I can also pull in a bunch of references with the highlights and with the notes that I've created while reading that paper, which again goes back to the previous point of it saves time because I do things just once. And because I can have that link, because I can pull all that information, all that metadata in, it makes it so much easier to use that information as I'm generating and developing my ideas in Obsidian around a topic. And then since I have all that there, again, it makes it so much easier to reuse it as I'm developing this topic for subsequent projects. Reason number 4 is something we've been touching on this whole video, right? And this is the power of linking your notes. And this is what I didn't realize was missing in all my previous knowledge management systems that I was working on over the years, and what is really unique and powerful about Obsidian, right? You open the application up and it's very much a blank slate, right? It's kind of akin to the time I opened up my first computer, or my dad opened up his first computer when I was a kid, and there was nothing there but MS-DOS, right? It was just a very blank slate that you could do something with. In Obsidian's the same way. You open it up and it's a blank slate, and it's really your experience to make. But the power is in what Obsidian can do, and that is linking notes. So I can create a note, I can create another note, and I can link the two through some simple language and through an idea, right? And so then I can follow that thread and I can link that second note to another idea and really follow that train of thought from note to note to note in a way that is really hard to replicate in other software systems. But what that does, that gives me the idea to capture all these different ideas, all these different thoughts that are related in some way. And so I may be reading a book on, pick a topic, doesn't really matter, and have a really interesting idea that I want to capture this one, right? So I write it down, I have some information there, and it reminds me of a note that I saved, maybe the day before on a completely different topic, right? There's something that has to do, that they both have to do this with the same thing. In fact, an example is I'm reading a book right now that's talking about virtue, right? And one of the things that we're talking about in this context, in this channel and on the blog, is excellence, right? And its corollary is virtue, right? And so I might be reading a book about virtue in one context and read something that reminds me of a specific virtue in another context, and I can link the two together in ways that I maybe not have thought of if I had just been reading one and then reading the other, right? When I have that random idea. And so creating these links allows me to be able to connect ideas in real time, right? And then when I go back and look as I'm developing an idea further, I can say, okay, what was I thinking back then, right? What did I link to before? And really flesh out some ideas around that central topic that I wasn't really thinking of in the, just on its own, right? It came because the notes were linked there. And so as we do this in our academic work and our productivity work, I can say I'm working on a topic, gallbladder ultrasound, which we referenced before. I can link in all the papers that have to do with gallbladder ultrasound. I can link in something about ultrasound of physics, but then that physics ultrasound, maybe we can pull that thread and find some other topic that I wouldn't necessarily have thought about when I talk about gallbladder ultrasound, but now it's helpful to kind of bring back into that conversation as we're rounding out this whole main topic. And so the power of linking notes is really the key to what makes Obsidian work so so well and what makes it such a powerful productivity tool. And this brings us to our fifth and final point, and that's this idea of digital gardening. I watched a video put out by Nick Milo, who's one of the main guys who talks about the power of Obsidian and how you can use it to develop this personal knowledge management system. And he's really one of the guys that's helped me get, going with Obsidian and develop it into what I'm using it for today. And he talked about this paradigm of a gardener versus an architect, really, and how the two of those can be helpful in terms of how we think about personal knowledge management, right? And really productivity and producing things. And so if you think about it, they're two very different professions or hobbies, right? In one sense, an architect is designing buildings, right? It has to be very precise, very exact. There's a lot of geometry, there's a lot of physics, there's a lot of math, right? Things that just are unbending when it comes to this is the way it works. There's a lot of rules in architecture that are required to make a building stand and last for, hundreds of years. On the other hand, gardening is very messy, right? We plant a garden every year. Our yield is, what it is, and it's commensurate with the amount of effort that we put into it. But it is a very messy affair, right? We put a seed in the ground, we try to pull some weeds, we try to make sure it gets some water, do some cultivating, right? We develop that ground and we work that soil, and in the end, we get a product, right? But in the process, there's just weeds everywhere, there's vines going everywhere, it's muddy, it's hot in the summer, it's just not a pleasant process, and it's dirty, right? It takes a lot of effort. And in that effort, it's really hard to see the fruits of your labor, right? And so we have these two different paradigms, a very exacting rules-based paradigm and a paradigm of just free form that eventually develops into a product, right? And as we think about our productive work in academic medicine, it is very much a hybrid of the two, right? There's very much rules for what you have to do, right? I'm trying to convey some scientific information, right? I'm trying to make it sure that it's accurate and that it's up to date and that it teaches the people what they need to know, right? If you're writing a paper, an academic paper, there is the introduction and there's the materials and methods and then the results and the discussion, and you have your conclusion. You have to write your limitations, and it's very precise in terms of the statistical methods that you use to develop that. But even in some of those rigid rules-based requirements of your work, there's room to be creative. There's creative options that are there. And in the process of getting there is oftentimes messy. And I think the best example I can think of is as I'm developing a lecture, right? I have an idea, right? I want to produce an introduction. Here's a couple salient points, right? A conclusion. And at the end of the day, have you as the learner take something away that's going to benefit your own practice of medicine at the bedside, or help you with some whatever the topic happens to be, right? And at the end of the day, it's very structured, right? You can definitely tell that there's an outline to this whole thing, but to get there, it's very, very messy, right? I have to take this idea, this random thought that I have in my head, and go out and research it and kind of develop, a basis of what is the background information, and maybe what are some nuanced things that we need to know. And okay, I got to weed out some of the really esoteric things and get to the main points. And then how do I even convey that main point, right? And what way do I order all my slides, and what visuals can I put on my slides, and how do I process this in such a way that, okay, it makes sense to me now, but how do I make this concept make sense to my learner? And that's a very, very messy process. And I oftentimes look back as I'm doing the project and be like, man, I am so confused right now. I just need to take a step back and synthesize this a little bit more. And so having a workspace where I can have a rules-based system, right, but also have the ability to be more free-form and develop and mold and shape that is really, really helpful. And Obsidian helps us do that because it allows us to write this stuff down, create notes, link to other notes, and capture all this information and make it archivable, but also retrievable, right? Make it something that I can find again as I'm kind of bringing this all together. And the more I do this, the more I develop, the more I hone and shape it, the more it becomes a product, becomes something that I can see and get my hand and mind around and really produce, a great lecture, a great paper that I can share with you. And so these are 5 different reasons why I think Obsidian has been helpful for me. Backing up just to review, we deal in an information economy, and we need to capture all the information we can as that idea emerges, right? Oftentimes these lectures develop as a seed, and I just need to capture it when I get that idea and really develop and build that idea. Number 2 is it's most helpful to do things once, right? It's really inefficient to read something, to write something, and then have to go and repeat the whole thing all over again for the next iteration of that project. And so just to have a way of getting it once and done, and then be able to come back to that information, the synthesized information, is really, really helpful. Number 3, we need a place to archive all of that data that we store, right? The journal articles that we read, the news clippings that we read, all that stuff. Archive that and then bring in the salient information from that archive to store that in Obsidian, to be able to develop and add that to this knowledge management, this knowledge bank that I'm really developing. Number 4, having the ability to link these thoughts together and daisy chain them in such a way that I can follow a thread and find these other random connections that I wouldn't necessarily have seen before is really, really helpful and powerful. And finally, having a place where I can just do the dirty work of being that digital gardener, but also have a product that I can produce as a digital architect is really, really helpful, where I can kind of work through that and have a system that's going to help me process through the messiness to get to that end result. And so hopefully this is helpful. Go ahead and download Obsidian. It's a free download. It's a community of people that use this, and there's tons of resources out there to help you get started. If you want some help getting started, I've put some stuff up on my website, excellentphysician.com. There's a couple blog posts about how I organize my vault and how to get things started. And over the course of this series, we're going to put out some more information, hopefully be a resource that you can use to help use Obsidian to really exponentially grow your academic productivity. So with that, we're going to wrap things up here. Have a great day. Take care, guys. See you next time. Bye.